Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Tuesday, December 31st, 2024. This is The Excerpt. Today we have details on next month's funeral proceedings for the late former President Jimmy Carter. Plus, the Treasury Department says Chinese hackers stole documents in a major incident this month. And we talk through some of the big airline topics in the new year. The official state funeral for former President Jimmy Carter will be held January 9th at the Washington National Cathedral, the White House confirmed yesterday. The Carter Center released a statement saying the family has accepted an invitation from Congress for Carter to lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda. Funeral services will begin on January 4th and end January 9th, moving from Carter's home state of Georgia to Washington, D.C. President Joe Biden has declared the 9th a national day of mourning, ordered U.S. flags to fly at half-staff for 30 days, and issued an executive order closing all executive departments and agencies of the federal government that day. Carter died Sunday at the age of 100. Chinese state-sponsored hackers breached the U.S. Treasury Department's computer security this month and stole documents. The Treasury called it a major incident, according to a letter to lawmakers provided to Reuters yesterday. The hackers compromised a third-party cybersecurity service provider called Beyond Trust and were able to access unclassified documents, the letter said. The Treasury Department said it was alerted to the breach on December 8th and that it was working with the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and the FBI to assess the hack's impact. It's been a rough week for aviation worldwide to end the year, headlined by a crash that killed 179 people in South Korea. Still, experts say commercial air travel remains very safe, and the U.S. aviation system is among the safest in the world. With that in mind, I caught up with USA Today consumer travel reporter Zach Wichter for a look ahead at some of the airline topics he's keeping an eye on in 2025. Hello, Zach.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for hopping on again today. So, Zach, you wrote about some of the airline topics you're looking out for in the new year. I think it makes sense to just start with Boeing, right? The company that has just stayed in the headlines in recent years. What's the expectation, Zach, for 2025 when it comes to really one of the world's most important aerospace companies?
2024 started off with an extremely high-profile incident involving a relatively new Boeing airplane when an Alaska Airlines flight lost a piece of the fuselage mid-flight. And since then, throughout the year, Boeing has really been in the headlines for various quality control issues at its factories and concerns with some of the new aircraft that were coming off the line. We saw, I believe, a production stoppage during part of the year. Things are slowly getting better. The company, on a tour that I went on of one of the factories out in the Seattle area in the spring, really emphasized that they are doing a lot to address the issues. They aren't trying to say that they're not happening. They're saying that they are working with their employees and the people who work on their factory lines to make sure that quality comes back to the forefront. And so I think the two big questions for me with Boeing are, do they continue on this trajectory? Like, are they actually addressing these issues and are things actually getting better? And then sort of relatedly, because part of this was increased regulatory oversight of Boeing, are we going to see that same kind of oversight in a new administration? There is some leeway in the federal government and with the regulators in terms of how hands-on versus how hands-off they choose to be with private companies. And so it remains to be seen if the Trump administration is going to take the same sort of active posture that the Biden administration did in its regulatory authority with Boeing.
You mentioned Biden and Trump. I think airline passengers often feel, Zach, really just kind of powerless to these companies, but we saw some new protections over the last few years. Will these be here to stay under Trump 2.0?
It may be kind of a mixed bag with the consumer protections. Some of them, like the automatic refund rule, were codified in recent legislation. And so that means it would take an act of Congress to repeal that rule. The automatic refund rule is that if an airline cancels or significantly delays your flight, you are automatically entitled to a refund without having to apply for it. and you should get that within 7 days to your form of payment if you paid with a credit card. And you're entitled to that if you choose not to travel on the delayed flight or on an alternative flight the airline offers you. Other things that were done through less formal but still official rulemaking at the DOT, those could be a little bit more up in the air. For example, the Department of Transportation recently finalized a rule on increased accessibility on airplanes and greater training for airline employees who handle mobility devices and who help transfer wheelchair users from their mobility device to seats on the airplane and interact with disabled travelers in other ways. That was, again, finalized. It's on the books now, but that's the sort of thing that a new administration would have a little bit more leeway to repeal or to not enforce as strongly because it's not actually law, it's just a rule, and there are just fewer enforcement mechanisms with that.
You know, Zach, some have criticized the Federal Aviation Administration for short staffing issues in recent years. Can you talk through that a little bit? And what's the conversation look like around the FAA going into the new year?
Short staffing at the Federal Aviation Administration has been a huge problem for many years, particularly in the air traffic control towers. Under the Biden Harris administration, they've kind of stemmed the tide of losses at the FAA. The workforce at the FAA was on a downward trajectory where they were losing employees year over year. And now, at the very least, that kind of has flatlined a little bit, and they're slowly starting to hire back up to the level that the FAA should be staffed at. And so it depends again on the priorities of the incoming administration. I believe that there's funding in the most recent FAA reauthorization, which is a 5-year piece of legislation. So they should be able, at least for the next few years, to continue hiring. But if money gets shifted around for some reason, or if the appropriation doesn't happen in exactly the right way, that's something that theoretically could change. And so that's just something we're going to be keeping our eyes on also.
All right, Zach Wichter covers consumer travel for USA Today. Folks can go find more of the cruising altitude column with a link in today's show notes. Thanks as always, Zach.
Yep, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
A New York federal appeals court yesterday upheld a jury's verdict that President-elect Donald Trump sexually abused and defamed columnist E. Jean Carroll and owes her $5 million for doing so. Roberta Kaplan, a lawyer for Carroll, thanked the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for its careful consideration, in her words, of the arguments. Trump spokesperson Stephen Chung said the American people have reelected Trump and demand a swift dismissal of litigation, including Carroll's lawsuit. Chung said Trump will continue to appeal the case. Carroll brought the lawsuit against the former president, claiming he assaulted her in a department store dressing room in the 1990s and then hurt her reputation by attacking her allegations as a con job in 2022. Trump has strongly denied her claims and disputed a Manhattan civil jury's unanimous verdict. While moving around boxes of decorations this holiday season, you may have noticed old stacks of documents from years ago. Can you throw them away? I spoke with USA Today personal finance reporter Daniel Devise about which records you actually need to hold on to. Hey, hello, Daniel.
Hey, good to see you. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you, sir. So let's talk about the records you should not throw out, starting with tax returns and other tax documents. How long should you keep these records, Daniel, and why?
First of all, we're not talking about Beatles records. Those, of course, you keep forever. Yeah, I looked into this because I was getting out my holiday decorations and I found all these papers in the basement. And this article I wrote really for older people who have paper because, the last 10, 15 years, most of us keep stuff online. So if you have stuff in the basement that's paper records that's like old, yeah, everybody kind of knows about the 7-year rule. And that is that we kind of vaguely know in the back of our minds that stuff related to taxes you're supposed to keep for 7 years. But I just basically reached out to a bunch of tax experts to ask if that means everything and kind of what that all comes from.
And let's just get into the specifics here, Daniel, of the tax documents specifically. I mean, which ones should you keep? Is there anything you can throw away? And you mentioned the 7-year rule. Is that really the rule, the kind of guiding light to go by?
Yeah, well, okay, so the IRS can audit you for any reason for 3 years. That I didn't know. The 7 year thing comes from if you make a serious mistake, like unreported income or something, then they have 6 years. And so the 7th year is like a buffer. So that's where the 7 year rule comes from. So given those facts, you should keep your tax returns always for at least 7 years. Some more conservative, careful CPAs would say keep your tax returns forever. And then the supporting documents, your W-2, your 1099s, receipts, expense records, by the same argument, you can usually toss those after 7 years because, again, the IRS, even if you make a really serious error, usually won't come after you after those 7 years.
So what about bank and credit card statements? What do the experts say here, Daniel?
If they don't have anything to do with your taxes, they can typically be shredded or recycled safely after a year, unless, again, you're keeping them for tax purposes. So my experts told me keep those statements from banks and credit card companies for at least a year. Arguably, if you're worried about it, one of my experts said, well, maybe keep them for 7 years because you never know. But those you can usually get rid of a little sooner.
So let's shift to property and investment records. How long do you need to keep track of these?
So this would be like if you buy a house or you have investments of any sort, you keep the records for as long as you have the assets. I call this 7 years plus, because then you also keep the records for 7 years after you sell. And I'm guessing that 7 year thing also has to do with taxes. So you sell your house, you keep the records of that house for at least 7 years after you've sold it, and then you can get rid of it.
Daniel, you and I talk a lot about retirement here on the show. When it comes to retirement records, does that 7 year plus rule apply here as well?
Same rule. If you have an IRA, 401k, you keep the records of that account, paper records, as long as it's active and for 7 years, because again, the 7 year rule after it's closed, 7 years plus.
And which records can you toss, maybe not needing to wait those 7 years? I know some listeners who maybe still do hold on to paper records or maybe eager to get some of that new year cleaning going and get some of those records out of the house. Which records can you toss?
Well, I pushed my tax experts, first of all, asked them, what other stuff do you really have to keep? Okay, and I've got like 5 categories: adoption papers, birth certificates, death certificates, divorce decrees, lawsuit stuff, marriage certificate, diplomas, transcripts, health immunization records. All those you're supposed to keep forever. There's other stuff like property assessments, social security statements. Some of those you keep until the next one comes. So if there's anything that I didn't mention in the last few minutes, you're pretty much safe following the 7 year rule and get rid of it after 7 years.
It sounds good. Daniel Devisay covers personal finance for USA Today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Happy holiday.
Thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your pods, and if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson, and I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.